There is a sound I will never forget. The sound of my own father saying my daughter's name like she wasn't mine at all, like she was something to be handed off, passed along, given away to settle a debt I never even knew existed. I was lying in a hospital bed, 26 hours of labor behind me, my body still trembling, still raw, still learning how to hold itself together after bringing a whole new life into the world. And my daughter, 3 days old, wrapped in a yellow blanket my mother had knitted, was asleep in my arms when my father walked into that room and said the words that would break something in me I don't think has ever fully healed. Give the baby to your brother. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I had too. I sat with it in silence, in shock, in a kind of disbelief that made the room tilt sideways. My name is Naomi. I was 29 years old the day my father tried to take my daughter and give her to my brother, like she was a possession, like she was property, like she wasn't a human being who had just spent 9 months growing inside my body, listening to my heartbeat, learning the sound of my voice. But to understand how we got to that hospital room, you have to go back. You have to understand my family. You have to understand my father. My father, Richard, was not a cruel man in the way you see in movies. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his hand. His cruelty was quieter than that, and somehow that made it worse. He had a way of rearranging the truth so smoothly that you'd walk away from a conversation with him confused about your own feelings, wondering if maybe you were the unreasonable one. He believed, deeply, unshakably, that a family was not a group of individuals. It was a unit, a machine, and every person in it had a function. My mother's function was to support him. My function, apparently, was to produce. And my brother, Caleb, my older brother, my father's golden child, his function was to inherit, to carry on something, a name, a legacy, whatever my father imagined our family to be building toward. There was just one problem. Caleb and his wife, Diane, could not have children. They had tried for 6 years. Doctors, treatments, procedures, heartbreak after heartbreak that I watched from a distance because Caleb didn't like to talk about it, didn't like to be seen as anything less than in control. And I understood that pain, I did. I ached for them. I never once wished for their suffering. But I never imagined that their suffering would become my father's excuse to reach for my childlike. She was a solution to somebody else's grief. Let me take you back further, though, because the warning signs were there long before that hospital room. They always are. We just don't want to see them. 6 months before my daughter was born, we had a family dinner. My father sat at the head of the table the way he always did, carving the roast like a king distributing his kingdom, and out of nowhere, in the middle of passing the potatoes, he said, "You know, Naomi, when the baby comes, you should really think about the bigger picture." I remember laughing, actually laughing, because I thought he was joking. "What bigger picture, Dad?" He didn't laugh back. He just looked at me with that calm, unreadable expression he always had when he was about to say something devastating in the gentlest possible voice. "Caleb and Diane have been through so much. And you're young. You'll have more children. This family needs balance." I looked at my mother. She was staring down at her plate, pushing green beans around with her fork, saying nothing. That was her function, too, I realized later. Silence. Her silence had been trained into her over 31 years of marriage, carved into her like a riverbed carves itself into stone, slow, patient, until it's just the shape water knows how to take. I told my father, very clearly, that I was not having a baby to give away, that my child was not a gift to solve his son's marriage. He simply nodded, the way you nod at a child who has said something naive, and changed the subject to the weather. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. My husband, Elijah, didn't believe me at first when I told him what my father had said. Not because he doubted me, because it was too absurd to process. "He was probably just being insensitive," Elijah said, rubbing my shoulders that night as I cried into a dish towel in our kitchen. "People say weird things about babies. He didn't mean it like it sounded." I wanted to believe that. God, I wanted to believe that so badly. But there was a small, cold voice inside me, the voice that had grown up in that house, that had watched my father operate for 29 years, and that voice whispered, he meant exactly what he said. The pregnancy continued. I tried to push the dinner conversation out of my mind, tried to focus on nursery colors and doctor's appointments and the small fluttering movements that eventually became kicks, became elbows, became a whole tiny person announcing herself inside me. I named her before she was even born. Everlie. It means boar in the wood forest originally, but I didn't care about that. I cared about the sound of it. Everlie. It sounded like safety. Like something that belonged only to me. My mother came to the baby shower. My father did not. He said he had a work commitment, which even at the time struck me as strange, because my father hadn't worked overtime in the 11 years since his early retirement. Caleb and Diane came, and I watched Diane's face throughout the entire party, watched her smile at the tiny clothes and the diaper cakes with an expression that was warm on the surface and something else entirely underneath. Something hungry, something aching. I felt for her. I really did. But feeling for someone and handing them your child are two very different things, and I never once considered those two things to be related. The labor came 3 weeks later, earlier than expected. 26 hours, like I said. Elijah held my hand through every hour of it, whispering encouragement even when his own voice was hoarse from exhaustion. And when Everlie finally arrived, when they placed her on my chest, still slick and warm and screaming with the full force of her brand new lungs, I understood for the first time in my life what people meant when they said their heart lived outside their body. Nothing had ever felt more mine. My parents came to the hospital the next morning. My mother cried when she held Everlie, real tears, the kind that surprised me because I hadn't seen my mother cry in years. She'd learned somewhere along the way that crying was an inconvenience to my father, so she simply stopped. But that morning, holding her granddaughter, something cracked open in her that I hadn't seen since I was a little girl. My father held Everlie too. He was quiet, contemplative. I remember thinking, in my exhausted, hormone-flooded state, that he looked moved. That maybe, finally, becoming a grandfather had softened something in him. I was so wrong. I was so devastatingly wrong. 3 days later, on the day I was supposed to be discharged, my father came back to the hospital alone. Elijah had gone home to prepare the nursery, to install the car seat, to make everything ready for us. My mother was down in the cafeteria. It was just me, Everlie, and my father in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had before. He pulled a chair close to my bed. He looked at Everlie in my arms with an expression I still cannot fully describe, tender and calculating at the same time, like a man admiring something he had already decided didn't belong to me. "Naomi," he said, in that same gentle, reasonable voice he used right before he said something unforgivable. "I need you to really listen to me, not react. Listen." I felt my whole body go cold. "Caleb and Diane's last treatment failed," he continued. "The doctor told them there's almost no chance now. Diane hasn't left her bed in 4 days. Caleb called me crying, Naomi, my son, crying like I haven't heard him cry since he was a boy. Dad, let me finish." He held up a hand, and old habit made me fall silent the way I always had at that table, the way my mother always had. "You're young. You and Elijah can have more children, many more if you want them. But this," he gestured at Everlie, at my daughter, like she was an object on display, "this could save your brother's marriage. This could give your mother the family she's always dreamed of, everyone under one roof, everyone happy." I could not speak. I actually could not form words. I just stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh and say he was testing me, waiting for anything other than what was actually happening. "You would still see her," he added, as though that made it better, as though that was the generous part. "Holidays, birthdays, she'd just grow up in a home that could actually give her everything. Caleb has the money, Naomi, the house, the stability. What do you and Elijah have? A rented apartment and a car that barely starts in winter." "Get out," I finally whispered. "Naomi, get out of my room." He looked at me the way he always looked at people who disappointed him, with a kind of tired disbelief, like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the one failing to see the bigger picture. He stood up slowly, and then he said the sentence, the one I will carry with me until the day I die. "Give the baby to your brother, Naomi. It's the right thing to do for this family." He walked toward the door, and that's when it opened and my mother stepped inside, her phone already raised in her hand, her face pale as paper, her eyes locked on my father like she was seeing him, truly seeing him, for the very first time in 31 years of marriage. "I heard everything," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Every word, Richard, and I recorded it." My father turned toward my mother slowly, like a man who couldn't quite process what he was seeing. My mother, quiet, obedient, 31 years of silence, was standing in that doorway holding her phone up like a shield, her thumb still pressed against the screen, the little red recording icon blinking steadily in the corner. "Margaret," he said, and his voice had changed. Gone was the calm, reasonable tone he used on me. This was something sharper. "Put that away." "No," she didn't move. She didn't even blink. "I've spent 3 decades putting things away for you, Richard. Feelings, opinions, my own name half the time because God forbid I ever disagreed with you at a dinner party. But not this, not her." She looked at me then, at Everlie sleeping in my arms, and something in her face broke open completely, like a dam that had held for 30 years finally giving way. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to me. "I should have said something the moment he brought this up at dinner. I should have said something years ago, about so many things." My father took a step toward her, and I felt my whole body tense, some old instinct rising up in me, but he didn't touch her. He just stood there, his hand outstretched, palm open. "Give me the phone." "No." "Margaret." "I said no, Richard." Her voice cracked, but she didn't lower the phone. "You just stood in a hospital room and asked our daughter to give away her newborn baby like she was returning a sweater that didn't fit. I heard you. I heard every single word, and I am done pretending I didn't. I want to tell you that this was the moment everything resolved neatly, the way it does in the stories we tell ourselves before we fall asleep. It wasn't. My father did not fall to his knees in some tearful realization of his wrongdoing. Men like my father rarely do. Instead, his face hardened into something cold and unfamiliar, and he looked at both of us, his wife, his daughter, like we were strangers who had wandered into his house uninvited. "You're both being hysterical," he said. "I made one suggestion, and you're acting like I committed a crime." "You didn't ask her to think about it," my mother said. "You told her to give the baby away. You told her it was the right thing to do for this family. I have it recorded, Richard, word for word." "What exactly do you intend to do with that recording, Margaret? Play it at the next holiday dinner. Humiliate me in front of everyone we know." "I intend," my mother said, her voice steadier now, gathering strength the way a fire does once it catches, "to send it to Caleb and Diane. Because I don't think they know you asked their sister to hand over her child like a transaction. I don't think Caleb would want a daughter who was given to him out of guilt and manipulation. I think my son has more decency than that, even if you don't." My father's jaw tightened. For the first time in my entire life, I watched my father lose his footing in an argument, watched him search for the next clever reframe and come up empty. "Get out," I said again, my voice stronger this time, steadied by my mother standing there like a wall between us and him. "Don't come near Everlie again, not until you understand that she is not yours to offer to anyone." He looked at me for a long moment, and then, without another word, he walked out of the room. I heard his footsteps fade down the hallway, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since the moment he'd said Caleb's name finally began, slowly, to loosen. My mother sat down on the edge of my bed. She was shaking. I realized I had never seen my mother stand up to my father in my entire life. Not once, not over anything, not even small things like which restaurant to choose or what color to paint the living room. And here she was, 31 years in, finally finding her voice over the one thing that mattered more than her own comfort. "I should have left him years ago," she said quietly, staring at her hands. "I told myself I stayed for you and Caleb, for stability, but watching him in this room just now, watching him talk about Everlie like she was something to negotiate, I understood something I think I always knew and never let myself feel. He doesn't see people, Naomi. He sees positions, roles, functions. He always has." I reached over and took her hand. It was the first time in years I had touched my mother without either of us performing some version of politeness for the other. It felt real. It felt like grief and relief tangled together into something too complicated to name. 2 days later, my mother sent the recording to Caleb. I wasn't there when he listened to it, but Elijah and I got a call from him that evening, and I will never forget the sound of my brother's voice. Hoarse, broken, ashamed in a way I had never heard from him before. "I didn't know," he kept saying. "Naomi, I swear to you, I didn't know he said that to you. Diane and I never asked him to, we would never." "I believe you," I told him, and I meant it. Because whatever my father's failures were, I never once believed Caleb had asked for this. He had simply been drowning in his own grief, and our father had seen an opportunity to play savior, to rearrange our lives like pieces on a board, believing all along that he was doing something noble. He told us Diane's treatment failed and that we should be patient, that he was working on something, Caleb said, his voice thick. I thought he meant counseling, support groups. Naomi, I would never take your daughter. She's yours. She was always yours. Diane got on the phone too, crying so hard she could barely speak, apologizing for something that was never her fault. And I found myself in the strange position of comforting the two people my father had tried to make into unwilling accomplices in his plan. It took months for our family to even begin to look like something whole again. My father did not apologize, not really, not in any way that felt true. He offered a stiff, clipped statement at a family gathering months later, something about not meaning any harm and only wanting what's best. And I understood in that moment that he would never fully see what he had done. Some people cannot. Their vision of themselves is too fixed, too armored, to let in the truth of their own damage. But my mother changed. Slowly and then all at once, the way real change often happens. She started seeing a therapist. She started saying no to things, small things at first, what movie to watch, what to make for dinner, and then bigger things. 6 months after that day in the hospital, she told my father she wanted a separation. I don't know if it will become permanent. I don't know if she'll find the strength to make it last. But I know that the woman who once pushed green beans around her plate in silence is not the same woman who sat beside me in that hospital room, phone raised, voice shaking but certain. Caleb and Diane, after months of grief and therapy of their own, eventually chose to pursue adoption, not because a baby was owed to them by anyone, but because they decided together, on their own terms, that this was the family they wanted to build. And when their son arrived, wanted and chosen and entirely theirs, I stood beside my brother at the small gathering they held to welcome him home, and I watched him hold his child the way I had held mine, like something the world could never talk him into giving away. Everly is 2 years old now. She has my husband's laugh and my stubbornness, and when I hold her at night, rocking her slowly in the dark, I sometimes think about that hospital room, about the sentence that nearly broke something in me, about the door opening at exactly the right moment, my mother's voice cutting through the silence she had lived inside for 31 years. I think about how close I came to spending the rest of my life wondering if I should have fought harder, if I could have fought at all, if the people who were supposed to protect me would have simply let it happen. But I didn't have to wonder, because when it mattered most, my mother found her voice. And in finding it, she gave me something I don't think either of us fully understood in that moment. Not just my daughter, safe in my arms where she belonged, but the truth about our family finally spoken out loud, finally impossible to take back. Some inheritances are not land, or money, or a name passed down through generations. Sometimes the only inheritance that matters is the courage to say no, even after 31 years of silence, even when your voice is shaking, even when the person you're standing up to is someone you once loved enough to stay quiet for. My mother gave me that, and someday, I hope, I'll be able to give it to Everly too.